The parking lot outside Miller's Gas and Diner looked the way it always did on a Tuesday afternoon. Half empty, sun-baked, the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. An old, dented pickup truck rattled in and parked crookedly near the entrance. Its paint faded to a dull gray blue. One headlight cracked, rust creeping along the wheel wells. Nobody in that parking lot had any idea who the old man climbing out of that truck really was. He moved slowly, deliberately, a worn ball cap shading his eyes, dressed in a plain flannel shirt that had seen better decades. To anyone watching, he was just another old-timer from out of town, driving a truck that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. What nobody knew, not the gas station attendant, not the diner staff, and certainly not the group of teenagers leaning against their cars nearby, was that in less than 10 minutes, this parking lot would become the setting for a story that small town would tell for the next 20 years. Before we get into it, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. I always love reading those. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, because we bring you stories just like this one every single week. All right, let's get back to that parking lot. The town of Larkspur Hollow wasn't the kind of place you'd find on most maps unless you were already looking for it. Population just under 3,000, one main street, a single traffic light that blinked yellow after 9 at night, and the kind of unhurried pace of life that made outsiders either fall in love with it or leave within a week. Everybody in Larkspur Hollow knew everybody else's business, which made it all the more surprising that almost nobody in town truly knew the man who had quietly moved into a modest house on the edge of the county nearly 15 years earlier. He introduced himself simply as Duke, no last name volunteered unless someone asked directly, and even then he offered Callahan with the same flat, unremarkable tone he used for everything else. He kept to himself. He tended a small garden behind his house, fixed his own fences, changed his own oil, and drove into town twice a week for groceries and gas in the same battered old pickup truck he'd owned longer than most of Larkspur Hollow's teenagers had been alive. If you'd told anyone in that town that the quiet old man from the edge of the county had once been one of the most famous faces in American cinema, a man whose movies had once filled theaters from coast to coast, whose name had once been printed in bold letters above the title, they would have laughed and assumed you were joking. Duke had spent decades building a different kind of life after his career ended, one defined by simplicity rather than spectacle. He didn't miss the spotlight. If anything, the years of anonymity felt like the truest version of peace he'd ever known. He'd learned long ago, from a weathered old Texas Ranger on a dusty ranch back in 1949, that real substance never needed an audience to prove itself. That lesson had shaped the rest of his life, long after the cameras stopped rolling and the world moved on to newer faces. Today was just another Tuesday. Groceries, gas, maybe a cup of coffee at the diner if he felt like sitting a while. He had no idea it would become anything more than that. The truck groaned as Duke pulled into the gas station, its suspension long past its prime, tires slightly mismatched from years of patchwork repairs done in his own driveway rather than at a shop. He parked near Pump 2, cutting the engine with a shudder that echoed across the lot. A group of 5 teenage boys stood nearby, leaning against a newer, flashier car that clearly belonged to one of their parents, passing time the way teenagers in small towns often did, with nothing particular to do and every intention of finding entertainment in whatever crossed their path. The moment Duke's truck rattled into view, one of the boys, a lanky kid with a smirk permanently fixed to his face, elbowed his friend and nodded toward the vehicle. "Would you look at that thing?" he said, loud enough to be heard. "Surprised it made it here without falling apart." A ripple of laughter passed through the group. Duke, stepping out of the truck, heard every word clearly, but his expression didn't change. He simply reached into the truck bed for his empty gas can, moving with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. He'd faced far louder mockery in far more dangerous rooms than this parking lot, decades ago, long before any of these boys were born. A little laughter over an old truck wasn't going to shake him. Still, the ringleader of the group, a broad-shouldered boy named Tyler, clearly used to being the center of attention among his friends, seemed to take Duke's lack of reaction as an invitation rather than a dismissal. "Hey, old man," Tyler called out, pushing off the car he'd been leaning against. "You sure that thing's street legal? Looks like it belongs in a scrapyard." More laughter from his friends, though a couple of them shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tone shifting from harmless teasing into something sharper. Duke continued toward the pump, unbothered, beginning to fill his gas can without acknowledging the comment. His silence, rather than diffusing the situation, seemed to embolden Tyler further. He sauntered closer, exaggerating a limp in mockery of the slight stiffness in Duke's gait, the kind that came naturally after 70-some years of a body that had lived a full and demanding life. "Bet he can barely walk," Tyler said to his friends, doing a poor imitation of an old man's shuffle, drawing another wave of laughter, though noticeably thinner now. One of the gas station employees, a young woman named Sarah, restocking a window display, glanced over with visible discomfort, clearly wanting to say something but hesitating, unsure whether it was her place to intervene in a dispute between customers. Duke finished filling his can, set it down, and for the first time turned to look directly at Tyler. His expression wasn't angry. It wasn't even particularly stern. It was simply calm, steady, and utterly unshaken, the kind of look that made experienced men pause and think twice, though a teenager with something to prove rarely recognized the warning signs. "You've had your fun," Duke said quietly, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable weight. "That's enough now." It should have ended there. Instead, Tyler, embarrassed at being addressed so directly in front of his friends, decided to escalate rather than back down. "Or what?" he shot back, a challenge poorly disguised as bravado. Duke didn't answer. He simply picked up his gas can and walked toward the diner attached to the station, leaving the question hanging in the air unanswered. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Duke stepped inside, the smell of coffee and frying bacon greeting him the way it always did on his Tuesday visits. A handful of regulars occupied the booths, an elderly couple sharing a plate of pancakes, a trucker reading a folded newspaper, a young mother with a toddler in a high chair. Duke made his way to his usual seat at the counter, nodding a quiet greeting to the waitress behind it, a woman in her mid-20s named Callie, who'd served him enough Tuesdays to know his order without asking. What Duke hadn't anticipated was Tyler and his friends following him inside, apparently unwilling to let the confrontation end in the parking lot. They filed in behind him, quieter now inside the diner, but still exchanging smirks and whispered jokes clearly meant to be overheard. Callie, sensing the tension immediately, set a cup of coffee in front of Duke and shot a warning glance toward the group of boys, now occupying a nearby booth. "Can I get you boys something?" she asked, her tone polite but pointed, a clear attempt to redirect their attention. Tyler ignored her, his focus still fixed on Duke's back. "Didn't mean to hurt your feelings out there, old-timer," he said, voice dripping with false sincerity that fooled no one. "Just making conversation." Duke didn't turn around. He simply wrapped his weathered hands around the warm coffee cup, his gaze steady on the counter in front of him. Inside, though the boys couldn't possibly know it, his mind drifted briefly to memories far removed from this small-town diner, moments from decades earlier, standing in far more hostile rooms, facing men whose intentions carried real danger rather than adolescent bravado. He'd learned patience in those years. He'd learned that the loudest man in the room was rarely the most dangerous one, and that silence, more often than not, spoke louder than any response he could offer. The tension in the diner might have simply dissolved on its own, the boys eventually growing bored and moving along, had Tyler not spotted the small, weathered photograph tucked into Duke's wallet as he reached for it to pay for his coffee. It was an old black-and-white photo, creased with age, showing a much younger Duke standing beside a horse on a dusty ranch, a faded signature scrawled across the bottom corner. "What's that, Grandpa? Some old picture of yourself trying to look tough?" Tyler said, reaching over uninvited and snatching the photo directly from Duke's hand before he could react, holding it up mockingly for his friends to see. The diner went silent. Even the trucker lowered his newspaper. Callie froze behind the counter, uncertain whether to intervene. For the first time since the confrontation began, something shifted in Duke's expression. Not anger, not aggression, but an unmistakable stillness. The kind of quiet, commanding presence that had once made outlaws think twice, and studio executives fall silent mid-sentence. He rose slowly from his stool, unhurried, and extended his hand, palm open. "That doesn't belong to you," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that instantly silenced the diner's remaining chatter. Tyler, suddenly uncertain despite his bravado, felt the shift in the room, but tried to mask it with a nervous laugh. "Relax, old man. I'm just looking." "Give it back," Duke repeated, his tone unchanged, yet somehow filling the entire room. It wasn't a request. Tyler, unsettled now by the sheer calm authority radiating from a man he'd dismissed as harmless minutes earlier, slowly held the photo back out. Duke took it gently, tucking it back into his wallet without another word, and sat back down at the counter as though nothing had happened at all. It was the elderly man in the corner booth, the one sharing pancakes with his wife, who first noticed something familiar in the weathered photograph glimpsed briefly during the exchange. He squinted, leaned toward his wife, and whispered something that made her eyes widen. Within moments, he'd risen from his booth and approached the counter cautiously. "Excuse me," he said quietly to Duke. "Forgive me for asking, but are you Jehan Wayne?" The diner, already tense from the earlier confrontation, seemed to hold its collective breath. Duke offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, neither confirming with enthusiasm nor denying with irritation. Simply an acknowledgement, quiet and unassuming. The old man's face broke into an expression of pure disbelief and reverence. "I grew up watching your pictures," he said, voice trembling slightly with emotion. "My father took me to see your films every single time they came to our town's theater. I never imagined I'd—" He trailed off, overwhelmed. Words spread through the diner in hushed, rapid whispers. "That's Jehan Wayne, the actor. I can't believe it." Even Callie, who'd served Duke coffee every Tuesday for the past 2 years without any indication of his past, stood frozen behind the counter, stunned. The boys in the booth exchanged wide-eyed, horrified glances as the weight of what they'd just done settled over them. The quiet old man they'd mocked over his truck, his walk, his age, was a man whose face had once filled movie screens across the entire country, a legend of a bygone era of American cinema, sitting quietly among them the entire time without a hint of the fame he'd once carried. Tyler, moments ago the loudest and most confident person in the room, now sat frozen in humiliated silence, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. His friends shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly wanting to disappear into the booth's cracked vinyl seats. After a long, heavy pause, Tyler finally stood, awkwardly approaching the counter. I didn't know," he mumbled, unable to meet Duke's eyes. "I'm sorry, I was just messing around, I didn't mean—" Duke raised a hand gently, cutting him off. Not with anger, but with the same quiet authority that had silenced the entire diner moments earlier. "You don't owe me an apology because of who I used to be," Duke said evenly. "You owe yourself better than how you acted back there, regardless of who was standing in front of you." Tyler blinked, clearly caught off guard by the response. Duke continued, his tone patient rather than lecturing. "A man taught me something a long time ago back when I was about your age, trying just as hard to look tough as you were back in that parking lot. He told me that the loudest men are usually the most scared ones. Real strength doesn't need an audience, and it definitely doesn't need to prove itself by making someone else feel small." The diner remained silent, every patron hanging on the quiet weight of Duke's words. Tyler swallowed hard, nodding slowly, something shifting behind his eyes, not just embarrassment, but the early stirrings of genuine reflection. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. And for the first time since walking through that door, he meant it. Over the next several minutes, the diner's atmosphere transformed entirely. A few other patrons approached cautiously, offering quiet words of admiration, a couple asking politely for an autograph, which Duke obliged with the same understated grace he'd carried throughout the entire encounter. He didn't seek out attention, didn't linger in the spotlight longer than necessary, gently redirecting conversations back to normalcy whenever possible. Callie, still slightly stunned by the revelation, refilled his coffee cup one last time, her earlier professional courtesy now tinged with quiet warmth and respect. "I had no idea," she admitted softly. "You've been coming here for 2 years. Duke offered a small, genuine smile. "Didn't seem important," he said simply. "Coffee tastes the same either way." When it came time to leave, Duke paid his bill exactly as he always did, thanked Callie by name, and made his way back toward the door. Tyler and his friends watched him go, no longer laughing, no longer smirking, their earlier mockery replaced with a visible, humbled silence. Outside, Duke climbed back into his battered old pickup truck, the same truck that had started the entire incident, started the engine with its familiar rattling groan, and pulled out of the parking lot exactly as unremarkably as he'd arrived. In the weeks that followed, word of what happened at Miller's Gas and Diner spread quickly through Larkspur Hollow, growing slightly with each retelling the way small-town stories always do. But beneath the exaggeration, something genuine had taken root. Tyler, in particular, seemed changed by the encounter in ways his friends noticed, even if he never spoke about it directly. He was quieter at school, less inclined toward the casual cruelty that had once earned him laughs from his group of friends. A few weeks later, when a new student showed up wearing clearly second-hand clothes and driving an old, weathered bicycle to school, Tyler was the one who stepped in when a couple of younger kids started snickering, quietly telling them to knock it off in a tone that surprised even himself. The old truck, once the target of ridicule in that parking lot, became something of a quiet local legend, occasionally pointed out by townsfolk to visitors with a knowing smile and the retelling of the day those boys found out who Jahan Wayne really was. Duke himself never spoke of the incident again, continuing his same quiet Tuesday routine of groceries, gas, and coffee, entirely unbothered by his brief return to local notoriety. Duke Callahan had spent the better part of his later years believing that real character required no audience, no recognition, no grand gesture to prove its worth, a lesson first taught to him decades earlier by a weathered Texas Ranger on a dusty ranch in 1949, long before fame ever found him and long after it eventually let him go. That lesson had carried him through an entire career built on quiet intensity rather than performance, and it carried him still into the simple, unremarkable life he'd chosen for himself in a small town that barely knew his name. The teenagers who mocked his truck that day learned something far more valuable than they expected to that Tuesday afternoon, that the quietest people in the room are often carrying the most weight, and that judging a man by the truck he drives or the clothes he wears says far more about the person doing the judging than the person being judged. Duke never asked for recognition. He never needed it. He simply drove home that evening in his old, dented pickup truck, the same as always, carrying with him the same quiet dignity he'd carried his entire life, proof that true character never needed to announce itself to be real. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, and I'll see you in the next one.